if you change the social context of human beings, their behavior changes. That is why I always say, when people say it's natural that we are competitive, it's natural that we are individualist. That's why I always say, yeah, it's natural in a context that primes you to be individualist or competitive, but it's also supernatural to be very, very communal and altruistic in an environment that primes that kind of behavior. That is why a lot of people in the West do not understand why Palestinians are so amazing in that sense, where they risk their lives to save an unknown 6-year-old child because she needs help, while they know they're probably going to die, and yet they go. And that is a kind of communalism, a kind of altruism that we in the West really don't understand. And why don't we understand that? Well, then you can be essentialist. Westerners are biologically more egoistic. And of course, that's racism. Of course, that's not true. It's because we are cultivated in the West by a economic, socio-political system that primes us continuously to be individualist. I almost wanted to say selfish in many ways.
We talk about capitalism, but in fact, this phenomenon really bloomed once it became joined at the hip with racism, with supremacism, right?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
supremacism requires that somewhere deep down in your verbal system, you see humans as not equal in terms of human worth.
Racism is a kind of what you could say is a kind of legitimizing myth. It legitimizes the inhumanity that you express to other human beings, to the extent that it actually becomes normalized and natural within your whole being, within your mind, within your emotion. And it's so incredibly powerful, and it keeps being reproduced. It's amazing. We're centuries further right now, and you have such a world majority who is at the receiving end of racism and still there. Why is it still there? Because capitalism is so successfully intertwined with racism, where those who benefit the most from racism also maintain the most capital. So it continuously reproduces itself. So that's why also racism is in that sense, you could say, not organic. It's being reproduced in order to maintain that kind of benefits that you see among the wealthy, and the wealthy are usually those who benefit from racism.
You can see that there is something fundamental going on in there, and when I go back also, to Marx and alienation, when you talk about alienation, you're talking about being taken away, alienated from some kind of fundamental nature. And I think we all resonate at some deep level with that. And capitalism is anti-human in that sense. Everybody knows it. It makes everybody sick. It makes Europeans are probably, whether in their settler colonies or in Europe, they have the worst mental health outcomes of probably the whole planet.
I think it's a hard thing to overcome, but fortunately, Europe is in the minority. I often call white Europeans like mutants of humankind, because it's not normal.
Where that deep need that you see in the West on the individual level, but also on the group level, just to be better than someone else, that obsessive need to be better than someone else.
Welcome to the special series of the Resistance is Fertile podcast, where we invite guests to talk a bit more deeply about psychology and different psychological perspectives. And today we are very happy to have as a guest Karim Betash, could be the first or second depending on how we put things out. And Karim has written an incredible article. It's in Personality and Social Psychology Review, and it's called "Where is Capitalism? Unmasking its Hidden Role in Psychology." We could talk about it for 5 hours, but we're going to start scratching the surface for 1 hour. And before we start, I want to say something more personal. Before we started the podcast, we did a few pilot episodes, and we reached out to people whose work we really admire on the internet. And Karim and BettBeat Media, you were one of those people, and you took time to listen to our pilot episodes and give feedback. And you gave one piece of feedback that I think I will carry in my heart for as long as we do this thing, which is just be yourselves, say what you really think, and don't pander to any audience, whether an audience you want to chase after or even the comments that people tell you. And I absolutely love that, because I think the first mission of psychology is self-determination, is to allow us to be who we truly are. And in your response, this is what you reflected. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you as our first guest. And maybe you can introduce yourself quickly, and then we can move on to discussing your article.
Sure, thank you for those kind words. I actually remember that email indeed. I'm Karim Betash. I am I have a small YouTube channel where I do a geopolitical analysis with my colleague Peter Beatty. We are both professors here in Hong Kong at the university, where we are in the Department of Global Political Economy. I'm a social and cultural psychologist by training, academic psychologist, I must say. And I'm originally from the Netherlands. My name is not Dutch, of course. My father is Algerian. My mother is Dutch. That made me very focused on the stuff that I usually talk about: racism, imperialism, capitalism, you name it. So in a nutshell, that's who I am.
Thanks. I really love the premise of this article, which made me think of this, famous Sherlock Holmes, the case of the dog that didn't bark in the night. And the premise of the article is there's been 100+ years of psychological research, and very little of it talks about capitalism. Very little of it talks about, the effects of capitalism on people's psychologies. And this is, the main focus of the article. So how did that come about?
Yeah, how did it come about? Interesting thing is, first I was trained in the Netherlands. Of course, the Netherlands is one of the leading countries I can say with regards to social psychology. A lot of studies on the way we behave, that we are very individualist, for example, in the West, but also what you just said, that we value self-determination and all these kind of things, but also very little focus on where that actually comes from. And the funny thing is when I started doing my PhD here in China, I actually became part of a very different school of thought. And there you can really see how culture intersects with psychology. In the sense that here in Asia, one of the biggest fields within psychology was actually cultural psychology. Whilst in the Netherlands, I only got one subject in my last year of my undergraduate year, I think, that was called cultural psychology. That's it. Here in Asia, it's huge, and you have phenomenal scholars that are really leading in this field. And increasingly, that changed my mind when it comes to psychology, where I started increasingly realize that how I was trained, that many of our behaviors come from who we are and our personality and our personal drives and all that kind of stuff, which is very normal in Western psychology. As a matter of fact, can also be just ascribed to culture. And that is something that drove me to think, okay, why is the West so individualist? why are Westerners so self-enhancing? Where does that come from? And that actually brought me increasingly to the argument that I put forward in the paper, that kind of individualism that you see in the West, that kind of how can you say that, almost atomization of the self, is because we are individuals who are raised in a capitalist context that cultivates things as individualism, competition, the chase for material gain, all that kind of stuff. And that is a bit why I started writing this paper. I was completely missing capitalism from the discussion. So to give you an example, in many of the you can say almost the seminal psychology papers that talk about individualism and collectivism, that comes from Geert Hofstede. He was a professor at my university in Groningen, the Netherlands. And that is very famous. Oh, in the East they're more collectivist, and in the West they're more individualist. And where does it come from? Well, then you get a very essentialist kind of Western thinking, Western psychology, that comes from very distal kind of processes, such as philosophical traditions of thousands of years old, or cooperation pressures that happened also thousands of years ago, or across thousands of years, such as disease prevalence and natural disasters that shaped a kind of individualist versus collectivist mindset. And I was like, but that doesn't make sense to me, that it's exactly the colonial capitalist countries that are so hyper-individualist. I mean, you can literally map the scores of individualism per country. And I can tell your audience to do that themselves right now, which countries are super individualist, and you will literally see the same color as during the UN, those who support Israel. Okay, so you literally see the Western colonial powers that are also hyper individualist, and not just that. You also see fluctuations of individualism in societies that adopt a capitalist kind of mode of organization. And I was like, okay, we need to insert this into the discussion on these cultural values, on these cultural behaviors, that it actually there are probably much more proximal explanations for why Westerners are so hyper individualist, but also why other societies become increasingly individualist, because we are in a globalizing capitalist neoliberal political economy, than to say, oh, that's tens of thousands of years ago, we were able to avoid diseases better here, and therefore we became more individualistic. Now, sorry, I don't want to insult all these fantastic scholars who did these deep historical analyses, because there's probably something to it. But yeah, I think there are very strong proximal explanations of why we are like that. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote that paper.
I loved your framing around capitalism as a generator of cultural syndromes, because it's been one of the things that's long frustrated me in psychiatry, and the way in which people talk about culture-bound syndromes. And this is always the foreign other, and it's talked about in very essentialized ways. In Mexico, this one thing happens. In Cambodia, there's this one single manifestation of a culture-bound syndrome, without any kind of nuance or deeper understanding or reflection of how the DSM is entirely made up of culture-bound syndromes. They act like that is the universalist and classic imperialist ideology, and everything else is culture-bound. So could you say more about how that framing came up and some of the things we can learn from it?
Sure. So in cultural psychology, we have something. So in the older days, they would call those cultural values in psychology, deep-rooted cultural values. But later on, they actually there were some scholars. I think I forgot the name right now, but there was an argument to call it cultural syndromes, and these syndromes are specific constellations of behaviors, thought processes that revolve around some theme that you see in certain cultures and that are rooted in the historical processes of these cultures. And I was like, an example is, for example, interdependence or collectivism. And I was thinking, these kind of cultural syndromes are hardly ever applied to the West. That's one thing. But the West is always how do you say that? Almost neutral. That has no culture. The rest has cultures. The West has no culture. But I must admit, there were luckily quite some East Asian psychologists who said that individualism is a Western cultural syndrome. But again, the explanation is often rooted in very distal explanations. And in my case, I say, okay, these constellations of behaviors and beliefs that revolve around some theme. I mean, the definition is perfect. Is very much, I think, explainable by capitalism. To give you an example, we have in the West very individualistic behaviors, and to give you an example, one theme is in capitalism, we in the West, but increasingly all around the world, are chasing for profit, are chasing gain, are chasing continuously self-improvement. And that is a cultural syndrome, that constant chase of self-improvement that is rooted, I say, in one aspect of capitalism. For example, the profit motive. Okay, our societies revolve around the profit motive. That is one aspect of capitalism. That profit motive gets institutionalized in the way our society works. We have the profit motive in healthcare, the profit motive in education, the profit motive, you name it. That becomes part of culture. So I say that jumps to culture. And then you get cultures, for example, that continuously celebrate for profit, growth and gain. Think about politicians. In the Netherlands, for example, every year when politicians talk about, during elections, they never talk about altruism or communality or social harmony. They pretty much only talk about growth. How much economic growth do we have? How good is our society doing? Oh, we're having growth. We're having more and more and more. And I say in that kind of environment, of course, if you as a human being, if you're conditioned in such an environment, everywhere you go, from healthcare to education to the media, your political system, that shapes a kind of mindset that is continuously focused on gain and growth. For example, you go to school to get higher marks. You get higher marks because you want a better PhD position. You want a good PhD position, the better university, because you want a better university, because you want to earn more money later on. So that is a bit what I'm trying to do, to tie the kind of political economic aspect of capitalism eventually to that individual level. And that is the human being, how that shapes our mindset and the kinds of motivations and behaviors that we express.
It's really interesting how, when I was listening to you, what came up to me is how there's this tendency to naturalize everything, right? So if you go, well, it comes from 2,000 years ago, and there's also this trend in evolution psychology. And it's really, again, the case of the dog that doesn't bark. It's hiding capitalism. It's hiding the political economy behind it that produces this particular psychology. And that psychology is, of course, necessary to the maintenance of capitalism. So on the one side, you have capitalism that is absent, but you also have the other absent, and you mention it in your paper, which is Marxism, which is this kind of critical analysis of the whole logic of the political economy and the interdependence of the political economy on the one side and what they used to call the superstructure or the ideology, the psychology on the other side. And I think your paper does a good job of pointing to that, but I'm guessing the counter argument to that would be something like, yeah, but isn't independent science supposed to be about letting all this ideological nonsense to the door and studying objectively whatever it is that we're studying? And how does that apply or not apply to psychology as a subject?
Yeah, well, that has been the counter argument for decades now, and I think it's a magnificent argument. I mean, it really worked well, because when you say, oh, that's not objective because you have a subjective explanation of the things that happen, and you need objective kind of empirical science where you simply only discuss observable data. But you know what the problem is when you test variables and you only focus on empirically observable data, is that you assume the context as natural. That is the problem. And psychology and sociology and other human sciences are inherently unrepeatable, or non-repeatable, I should say. Inherently non-repeatable. That is, if you change the social context of human beings, their behavior changes. That is why I always say, when people say it's natural that we are competitive, it's natural that we are individualist, that's why I always say, yeah, it's natural in a context that primes you to be individualist or competitive, but it's also supernatural to be very, very communal and altruistic in an environment that primes that kind of behavior. That is why a lot of people in the West do not understand why Palestinians are so amazing in that sense, where they risk their lives to save an unknown 6-year-old child because she needs help, while they know they're probably going to die, and yet they go. And that is a kind of communalism, a kind of altruism that we in the West really don't understand. And why don't we understand that? Well, then you can be essentialist. Westerners are biologically more egoistic. And of course, that's racism. Of course, that's not true. It's because we are cultivated in the West by a economic, socio-political system that primes us continuously to be individualist. I almost wanted to say selfish in many ways. I don't want to mix the two too much. And at the same time, when you have a child from the West, and the child, I always say, you bring that baby immediately to another society that is communal. It doesn't matter that it's a white European. That child will become a very communal human being. And that is why I always say psychology needs to focus more on social context. And I got that I don't want to sound arrogant here. I'm just copying stuff that I learned here in Asia. Here in Asia, you have that contextual focus much stronger. And I applied that to many of the psychological issues that we see today, that we discuss today in the field.
It reminds me of how ideology it's not present. It's that it's intentionally obscured in these processes to pretend as if we can naturalize this. And so in the context of psychiatry, I oftentimes would have arguments with people about the way in which studies are funded, that we can't actually trust these studies about comparing these antipsychotic drugs because look who funds them. And so look at how that is going to influence how the study is designed, how it's powered, all of the parameters of how research is done. It's not this just inherently objective thing because we're doing Western science. That is a part of the ideology itself. And one side of it, similar to the way that culture-bound syndromes are of the other, this is just neutral. This is the baseline.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I also write in the paper by saying that by not discussing this is not objective. That is not neutrality. By not discussing it is simply supporting the status quo. And that is, I'm still amazed. It's published in PSPR. PSPR is pretty much the highest journal in my field. So I thought, oh no, this is too radical for them. But at least a lot of people will read it now. So I'm happy about that. And that that is something that is happening, and I don't know about psychiatry, but I suspect it's very, very similar. But that is something that has been an issue in that's why I call it so efficient and so ingenious. That so-called objectivity that we so-called have in the field, and where we cannot question these kind of contextual and historical questions, because that is subjective. That kind of decontextualized objectivity, so-called objectivity, is in fact extremely subjective, because you do not question the kind of social relations that are being created in our system, because you now assume them as natural. They are normal. You don't question those. You only question the laws, the relationships within that system. And it's amazing, because you by not questioning that, you're supporting a system and unequal power relations right now that benefit a few and that disadvantage the many.
Yeah, and so natural that Mark Fisher, that you quote in your paper, in his Capitalism Realism, said it's become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? Which is the greatest victory of capitalism. But I fancy that your article being published in this very prestigious review is probably a straw in the wind that the walls are maybe cracking. So you come at it from the perspective of social psychology, and Nunja and I are more on the clinical side of things. Nunja as a psychiatrist, me as a clinical psychologist. But the role of context, I actually come from one corner, of the psychological universe called contextual psychology. And so we know about the role of context, and behaviorism in general has been really also very focused on context, but not social context. So that piece has been missing. I've always loved that meme. It started with, before diagnosing yourself with depression, make sure you're not surrounded by a-holes. And then the internet led to it up and said, before diagnosing yourself with depression, make sure you're not living in capitalism. And I think that is really bringing it back in. And the way you come at it from the perspective of social psychology, but you come a little bit on our own turf by identifying these capitalist syndromes. And I'd love to hear you, tell us what syndromes you've identified. And I was also fascinated that it's based on quite a lot of, social psychology research.
Yeah, so I actually heard one that I also found very, very cool. I think it's maybe it was an internet meme or something. Probably you guys know it, but there was somebody who said like, pessimists are not pessimists; they're just people who are disappointed a lot in life. And I found it such a good one. Like when you say, you're just a pessimist, you're such a pessimist, and then you assume that person is inherently pessimistic, negative. But no, that's just somebody who had a life experience of a lot of disappointment. So you become pessimist. I love that saying. So your question was about the syndromes that I talked about. Yeah. So what I tried to do was, so there are probably so many kinds of syndromes that I could talk about that are being cultivated in our societies. So what I was trying to do is to get a macro perspective to the individual psychology that we have today. That is, I don't know how that is in contextual psychology or psychiatry, but in social psychology and even in other subfields of social psychology, that is really missing. So, for example, I always say the psychology that we see today are the result of geopolitical relationships over hundreds, even thousands of years. Imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, all that kind of stuff. And I tried in that paper to squeeze that all in. And I just read chapter and book after book and to try and see if I can combine all that stuff. And one of the arguments that I make is that the kind of mindset that developed in Europe, a relatively cold climate, limited arable land, very competitive history, a lot of war, material gain became very important in that kind of environment. You also see it, for example, with other low resources parts of the world. Think about Mongolia, Japan, become very expansionist, violent cultures, often very imperialist. But the Europeans really are how can you say that? Gerald Horn, one of our guests, always say a heavyweight champion of white supremacy. I would say also the heavyweight champion of war and domination and colonialism. And co-evolving with that kind of mindset, material gain, competition, individualism, came, of course, expansion. So the expansion of the Europeans across the world to expand that material gain, expand that kind of competitive mindset, which resulted in the most expansionist, most imperialism, and I dare to say most violent group of people in human history. And co-evolved with that kind of mindset was the system of capitalism, the socio-political system of capitalism, where that material gain slowly became institutionalized, such as for-profit, competition, ownership, private ownership. All these things are super important in our societies. And that kind of focus, continuous focus of our society creates, that's my argument, creates psychological mindset, chronic psychological behaviors and mindsets. And I pick out these three very well-known capitalistic kind of phenomena. That is continuous for-profit, search for profit, market competition, continuous focus on competition, market competition, and private ownership, the almost idealization of ownership, private ownership, materialism, and that kind of stuff. And growing up in a society like that, in school, you compete with your peers for the best grades, the best positions. You go to work, you want to earn more and more money, better job, higher job. So that's that for-profit motivation. You want to show that you are worthy. You have a good position. You have a good job. You did well when you competed. So that's that material aspect. So you want to have good clothes, show it with jewelry. I'm saying very simplistic ways now. A good house, all that kind of stuff that is really rooted in these three very well-known components of capitalism: for-profit, market competition, ownership. That shapes our mindset. And these kind of mindsets related to these capitalistic features is what I call the kinds of syndromes that it creates. So we have a syndrome that focuses on gain and growth, that is related to the for-profit aspect of capitalism. I call it principal component in my paper. And we have a very kind of rivalry mindset, where we compete with others for the best positions, the best jobs, looking better than the other one, being more handsome, more pretty, all that kind of stuff. That is rooted, I would say, in that kind of market competition that's cultivated. And then we also, of course, we want to have a good house, look good, have nice clothes, have possessions, all these kind of materialistic kind of values, and that is related to that ownership that is very much venerated within capitalism. And part of these syndromes, you get a lot of behaviors, typical behaviors, when you study the research, that are usually assigned to just being a cultural aspect of being Western, of individualist cultures, such as, for example, the entrepreneurial self. The entrepreneurial self is a typical individualist kind of mindset that comes from the West, that is rooted in the Protestant work ethic and that kind of stuff, which makes sense, but it's never tied more proximally to how that is continuously cultivated wherever we are. That kind of self-optimization, self-improvement, which is part of that. What I would say that gain primacy syndrome that is connected to the for-profit feature of capitalism. So I try to show in the paper that when you tie all these aspects of capitalism to human behaviors, you will find that typical Western individualist behaviors can be connected to capitalist societies. That's why I wrote a very big paper. It's super hard to put it on the words very quickly, but I hope I hope it's understandable.
Don't worry, we have another 10 hours to discuss it.
Yeah.
Usually, when talking about how capitalism is making us sick, we're talking about things directly related to the economic base. And so how exploitation is making us sick, racism is making us sick, all of these pieces that are coming much more directly. But here you're talking about how the superstructure of capitalism is making us sick towards these unhealthy psychological approaches that, I mean, it will be normative. Like, it's not healthy for us to have these kinds of mindsets around competition, gain of profit, etc., that they make us sick, not just individually, but collectively as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you ever heard of the biologist Frans de Waal. Ever heard of that biologist? Yeah, Frans de Waal. I try to make it very multidisciplinary in my paper. That's why I actually quote Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal is focused on monkey behavior and primate behavior, and he also said that whole focus on competition, that continuous idea that life is a gladiator show, social Darwinism, is actually is a very unnatural and unhealthy way of seeing things. Because even in the animal kingdom, you would see that competition usually is outcompeted by the need for cooperation. But we live in societies that are so focused on that kind of individualism, and an aspect of that individualism is, of course, competition, where it has become it had pretty much become invisible. The idea that this is so normal, nobody ever questions it, that you are sitting in a classroom with your fellow classmates, and that you guys are just continuously looking at each other, downward comparison, upward comparison, who has higher grades, who has lower grades, who is doing better. And this kind of society, this kind of thinking, in my opinion, is very, very bad. It's very unhealthy for society. And I think we see it in many ways. When you tie that kind of superstructure, what you're saying, Nunja, I like the way you put that, to our individual behavior. It also goes, of course, backwards. If you the other way around, if you see how our behaviors right now shapes certain kinds of superstructures, think about Israel, Palestine. You can never disconnect these things. These are, you really see a clash of, in my opinion, hyper-capitalist, individualist, self-enhancing group of people that are Zionists, versus a way more altruistic, communal kind of society. One is incredibly, how can you say that? Almost without empathy. It's incredibly brutal, without compassion. It's baffling that you have such a lack of compassion, and you have another group of people where even when you know you're going to die, you're still trying to save your fellow human beings, even though snipers are shooting right at the time that you're running to those dead bodies, because you want to give those strangers a proper burial. It's really amazing. And what that means to me is that we are cultivated into a mindset that is I think, an extremely unnatural human phenomenon. And it makes sense, because it's really, like I said in the beginning, when you compare very individualist cultures to non-individualist culture, it's pretty much the colonial powers versus the rest of the world. The problem is, unfortunately, and I have no way to solve that. I've discussed it with my co-host. The problem is, how do you solve this? Because those who are very communal, collectivist, have that less of that urge of competition and rivalry. These people usually do not have the mindset and the tools to deal with the brutal violence of those who think like that. So they are always on top. So, in other words, capitalism is an expression of the psychopathic mindset that always wins. And I have no idea how to solve that. Now I'm making it a bit geopolitical, but I hope you understand what I mean.
This is why I'm not pessimistic, but just disappointed. Well,
Yeah.
actually, on that point, it brings up a few things about me. You talk about Franz de Waal, and it's kind of a evolution psychology lens. And there's been a lot of really interesting work in to do with evolution, with two main evolutionary strategies, one being cooperation and the other one being competition. There's the work of David Sloan Wilson on that. There's the work of Eva Jablonka also, looking at evolution in different dimensions. And basically the argument is, depending on the context, different strategies, cooperative or competitive, will win out. And the problem, I mean, I love that argument, makes a lot of sense, and humans are fundamentally collaborative. Even in contradistinction with other primate species, we are so highly collaborative that we are closer to bees or termites, who also build high rises, by the way, than we are to chimps, right, who are not as cooperative as we are. And this is due to language, this is due to a number of things. So cooperation is inside the human experience. But then again, in those kind of analyses, I think capitalism is missing. So they go, yeah, in times of war, psychopathy, if you like, individualism is rewarded, and in times of peace, it's more kind of collaboration. But they're missing the elephant in the room. No, in times of capitalism, it drives towards this, as you say, psychopathic mindset. But I actually don't share your pessimism. I've heard your argument, and it makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense in the clinic. The argument that goes, the problem with non-psychopaths is they are unable to imagine how psychopathic psychopaths are. They're just unable to imagine how low, how inhuman these people will go, how they are willing to make other human beings into not just objects, but dust, if necessary, lampshades, whatever. And that's why they are always at a disadvantage. If I may say, I think this is a little bit too much of an individualistic argument. Like, again, if you look at the broader social dynamics, it probably depends on the social dynamics around you. But when you drill down into the individual mindset, and in your paper, you actually identify it, I think, in the three syndromes. I'm looking at your great diagram. I talk about market competition, and there you go about upward, downward comparisons. And I think in terms of formation of individual, but also collective senses of self, and it makes us live into what I call verbal systems. There are things that are mostly unconscious to us, but that are extremely logical, and that we learn in interaction with the people we grow up around, and therefore our communities, our political economies. And inside of this, what you think, what you feel, what you do makes a lot of sense. And in the clinic, we see the discontent with that, the problems with that, with people coming and they have a basic sense of self based on me not as worthy as others, right? At the basic level of human worth. And of course, you have two sides of this. You have the me less worthy, which is the people we tend to see in the clinic, and you have the me more worthy, which is the people you tend to see in Western politics, right? You don't suffer from it. But both of these things don't work because it excludes you from common humanity, and it excludes others from common humanity. And I think this is where the link is made psychologically between capitalism and supremacism and racism. You know, Gerald Horne is great to say, we talk about capitalism, but in fact, this phenomenon really bloomed once it became joined at the hip with racism, with supremacism, right? And
Absolutely, yeah.
supremacism requires that somewhere deep down in your verbal system, you see humans as not equal in terms of human worth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is at the root of most of the DSM at the end of the day, which is a very Western syndromal classification. Basically, people suffer because deep down they can't see themselves as part of common humanity, they can't see themselves as part of community, and they can't live inside those spaces. And so there is something central in there that you point out in your paper, but I think it doesn't make me despair. It makes me think, okay, if this is what it is, then we can certainly cure it individually in the clinic, but it's too much work, digging people out of holes that capitalism keeps on digging even bigger at the individual level. But it also gives us something to both understand the cultures that resist, like indigenous cultures, like the Palestinian culture, for example, and also gives us a basis to start putting out a more collaborative psychology as an antidote to that dehumanizing, anti-human project.
Yeah, very well said. It's also a chicken and egg problem, of course. What was it? Was it capitalism that created racism, or was it a racist mindset that also developed capitalism? But probably it's a bi-directional relationship. But you say something very important there, and I've been writing about it a lot also on BettBeat Media, my Substack, is that racism really destroys the humanity, not just of its victims in a way that victims are literally killed by racism, but also the humanity of those who are who are the benefactors, you could say, of racism. Racism is just pure is white supremacy. Let's be honest, with being white European on top.
Yeah.
And racism is so effective, to just get into what you just said, is because racism is a kind of what you could say is a kind of legitimizing myth. It legitimizes the inhumanity that you express to other human beings, to the extent that it actually becomes normalized and natural within your whole being, within your mind, within your emotion. And it's so incredibly powerful, and it keeps being reproduced. It's amazing. We're centuries further right now, and you have such a world majority who is at the receiving end of racism and still there. Why is it still there? Because capitalism is so successfully intertwined with racism, where those who benefit the most from racism also maintain the most capital. So it continuously reproduces itself. So that's why also racism is in that sense, you could say, not organic. It's being reproduced in order to maintain that kind of benefits that you see among the wealthy, and the wealthy are usually those who benefit from racism. And it's what can I say? It's I always wonder, like, how do you get out of this? How do you get out of this? We're talking now hundreds of years. We have beautiful writers, Frans Fanon, and we have Malcolm X, and it's just like I wonder how we can get out of this. Sometimes I feel very, very hopeless about this, because when I see what's happening in Palestine, Israel, Palestine, I'm like, this is the culmination of everything. This is the culmination of capitalism. This is the culmination of colonialism. This is the culmination of racism. You can almost say that the Zionists are peak peak capitalism, colonialism, racism. This is the end point. This is the end point. So it should be a warning for us all to change the system, because this is what you create. This is what you continuously recreate. You know what I mean?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's a hard thing to overcome, but fortunately, Europe is in the minority. I often call white Europeans like mutants of humankind, because it's not normal. Like, this is not the whole of human history. Unfortunately, we do have so many like different indigenous backgrounds and cultures to draw on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would credit that for like having grown up like within the United States of genocide, still having this kind of mindset, is that it comes from lineage and it comes from connection with the land, and that is something that is more powerful than what the psychopaths can do. And that connection with the land and that love is so powerful that it allowed us to win, right? At the end of the day, and we're also winning the moral war, like the ethical war of demonstrating your humanity. But one aspect of that I wanted to ask about is how your own cultural background and your own journey in different contexts, you spoke to this at the beginning, has influenced your ability to notice and have awareness and develop an analysis of these things, and how we can undo some of what is trying to be obfuscated and bringing it out into the light.
Yeah, no, definitely. You say a couple of very good things there. My own personal experience is I would say, that's why I always say objective science doesn't exist, because the reason why I do these things are deeply rooted in what they always beautifully call in the social sciences your positionality. So I so I must say my positionality really influences the way I
That's
conduct my.
interesting to make you not understand you're talking about normal stuff, and you took you 8 years to get there.
So my own position in life indeed really influenced my angle in my research, but that is also what keeps me going, because academia, of course, is not the most fun part of the working world to be part of. But if you have kind of intrinsic goals, moral goals, then it makes it very, very doable and sometimes even enjoyable. But I grew up in the Netherlands as a half Algerian, half Dutch kid. My mother is Dutch, my father is Algerian, and I grew up in the north. So my mother is actually a Frisian. Frisians are actually you could pretty much say indigenous northerners of the Netherlands, and so they have their own language and that kind of stuff. A bit like the Sami in what you would see in the north of Scandinavia, and I grew up in that part of the Netherlands, the north, as one of the few mixed kids, which shaped my understanding of how the world works from a very early age on. And in particular with my name, oh man, that's an uphill battle since you are in primary school, since you are in even how do you say that in English, kindergarten, or even the younger, when you're like 4 or 5 years old, and that has always been an aspect of my life. Like, why are these identities so important? Why are some people continuously fighting an uphill battle because of their ethnic identity? And where does that come from? Why is that reproduced? And then I had my mother, of course, was a Frisian, and her father was a hardcore communist, so a really Northern European, hardworking, typical Dutch communist. And and he was very anti-capitalist. And my mother always said, because it has never been, how can you say that, conscious, that I started focusing on this, or conscious, I should say. It's never been like, oh, I knew that from my granddad and therefore not at all. But I love what my mom once said, and she said, "You really look like your granddad." I said, "Why?" "What you do on social media and with your YouTube videos and that kind of stuff, in your granddad's day, you didn't have that. So you know what he did?" I said, "What?" And this is true. This is almost too idealistic, but really it's too funny but true. He would go with a box to the town square. He would stand on the box and shout anti-capitalist stuff. I kid you not, really true. and my mom has still the old black and white photos when he was young, and he did that. And she said, in a way, you're doing exactly the same. It's just an online town square now. In those days, you didn't have that. I really loved that. I was like, oh yeah, it must be in the blood. But also my dad's side, French colonialism in Algeria. We lost multiple people in our family in the fight against French colonialism. And all these things, when you talk about these, you had such a good term for that, Nunja. What did you say? Superstructures, yeah. When you talk about those superstructures, I started really tying these things like, hey, colonialism in France, my dad's history, racism in the Netherlands based on my mixed identity, my granddad who was a communist who fought against Nazi Germany. And suddenly you start to tie these things, like, oh, so in other words, as a little kid in school, and you're being disadvantaged because you have an Arabic name, Arabic background, is actually related to all these bigger historical things, such as Dutch and French colonialism. You know what I mean? And then, yeah, that's a bit in a nutshell how I started to tie these like macro level things to our individual psychology, in particular our psychology of inequality. And one more example I want to give, Nunja, and then I'll stop, because this is also something I can talk for ages about. But I never forget, as a little boy, and maybe you can recognize that, Nunja, is that when I grew up as a kid, I was born in the 80s. And the 80s and the 90s were really the heydays of Hollywood. And I won't say every movie, but most movies I saw were Rambo types shooting hordes of Arabs. And Arabs were always terrorists and bad people and scary and this and that. And I never forget asking my mom when I was like a very young kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old. I said, "Mom, why do all the bad guys always look like the people from my father's family?" Really, I really was like, as a kid, it made no sense to me. And that always stuck with me, because I've learned from an early age that this is the way, that kind of contextual bombardment of our brain is the way you maintain these kind of individual behaviors between people who treat you different because you're brown, or you have an Arabic name, or you have a multicultural background, or a different cultural background. And it's really true. I remember one time, he's still my one of my best friends. He said, "I remember as a kid when we were watching movies, you were always complaining about why this makes people racist." And he was like, "I was so sick of you always saying that." He said, "Just when we watch a movie, you whine about like, oh, that's racist." And he said, "Really, now we're both in our 40s now, early 40s." And he now said, "Finally, I realized it made sense what you said as a kid. It made sense." He said, "I just didn't see it, you know." So that's a bit of my life story, Nunja. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and how I experienced it is, and this is just like to bring back again the layer of being indigenous in the outside world, is that yes, I have an Arabic last name. Why? Because Amazigh names are illegal. And so I get the wrong racism. And so that's also really fundamentally informed my perspective, is that, yeah, I experience all the anti-Arab racism, but I'm not Arab. And that's a whole other layer of why my family was displaced to begin with. And so it's sort of like double, triple, quadruple whammy that you're getting all at the same time as being an Amazigh person in the West, where you are assumed, and you're getting even from white people the Arabization imposed upon you. And people then say, well, why don't you speak Arabic? Your name is Arabic. I say, well, because our names are illegal. And so it just shows how multi-layered it is as folks who are still deeply connected to community, that the forms of racism get extra twisted in the West.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have the same thing as you. I mean, I'm not religious. I'm not a Muslim, but I will be always categorized immediately as a Muslim. So, for example, to give you an example, that kind of racism / Islamophobia. When I write about racism in the Netherlands, you can literally find a list of traitors. So you have in Netherlands, you have these extreme right-wing websites with a list of traitors, and then you have like Muslims. I am on that list. You know what I mean? It's the bad side of racism. That's I can totally identify with that. To the Westerner, it doesn't matter. Seriously, it doesn't matter if you're Iranian, Turkish, Moroccan, Algerian, Egyptian. You're just a brown Arab, and you're a Muslim. That's the way it works.
Yeah, but the interesting piece there is that this is also kind of how social context influences the psychology of who you see yourself aligned with. Is that growing up, I saw anti-Black and anti-African racism, and I thought that that's us because we're African, we're Indigenous African people. And so that's where my alliances and sense of group selfhood has always been linked to, is that we are African peoples, anti-African racism in whatever form is like towards us, whereas the Middle East is another thing. It's completely separate from us. So it's just to speak to, I think, linking it back again to how all of our social contexts in which we've grown up have influenced then how we interpret the world and the dialectic back and forth.
So, if I may, I want to bring the conversation back to capitalist syndromes. And in what you both just said, there's something really interesting, which to me goes to the heart of why I have hope. We had a conversation about hope. I'm not a big believer in hope, but why I think it's doable. And it's because at the heart of those verbal systems of unequal human worth, they're not livable systems. They make people who live inside of them suffer as whatever position they have, whether they be on the side of the white European or on the side of the colonized, of the racized. I don't know how to say it because race is this crazy concept to start with. And you sit in the clinic when you can connect people on an individual basis to their sense of common humanity, of equal worth, like, I'm just as worthy as a human being, not more, not less, just by simple virtue of being a human, nothing more, not what I've done, nor where I come from, what I think, what I feel. You can see that there is something fundamental going on in there, and when I go back also, to Marx and alienation, when you talk about alienation, you're talking about being taken away, alienated from some kind of fundamental nature. And I think we all resonate at some deep level with that. And capitalism is anti-human in that sense. Everybody knows it. It makes everybody sick. It makes Europeans are probably, whether in their settler colonies or in Europe, they have the worst mental health outcomes of probably the whole planet. It doesn't make people happy. So there is, again, going back to more dialectical understanding, there is a contradiction at the heart of the system, which I think will lead to a negation of the system. And that contradiction is that sense of unequal human worth. And the antidote to it is, yes, community is, I think, Nunja, you're really big on that. And Karim, you gave such a beautiful example of lineage, how you can relate to others that came before you and to others that will come after you, to a connection that is bigger. I say common humanity, but I mean it much broader, connected to your environment. And on the one side, you have this project, which I think speaks to humanity. And the other project at the end of the day is so anti-human that they want to become transhuman, leave humanity, and so anti-planet that they want to fuck off to Mars. But it's inside the logic of it. And you can't actually live as a human inside of it. And I think this is why human societies are producing their own antidotes. And of course, all of us, and I think it's, for me, 100% true, and for you, some percentage, over 50% true. We are still steeped inside that Western mental universe. And we believe that the international community is the fucking, Putin calls it the golden billion or whatever. But we don't see that it's not working anymore. People don't buy it anymore. And those communal identities doesn't really matter at the end of the day if they're Arab, if they're African, if they're Asian, if they're Confucian or whatever you have. But they are just, they relate you to some sense of community and some sense of equal worth. Even when I look at China, there is a sense of, okay, we're here working for the people. We're working for common society, for common humanity, rather than this crazy idea that if everybody is as selfish as they can be, by some miracle, everybody will be happy, which, is fucking stupid on its face.
Yeah. Yeah, amen. I've always wondered this. I've always had this question in mind, and it is really a pathology if you think about it. Where that deep need that you see in the West on the individual level, but also on the group level, just to be better than someone else. That obsessive need to be better than someone else. It's the more you think about it, the more you realize what a deep pathology that is. I mean, when you go on Western social media platforms like Twitter or whatever, you really see it culminate there. This hyper aggressive need, like to put others down and to be better. And Elon Musk is such a good example of that complete. You were saying that doesn't matter the position in capitalism. These people are deeply unhappy and not. It doesn't work for them. Life. And sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I may interrupt. It's not just better than everyone else. It's better than yourself. I have clients coming. I want to be the better version of myself. I want this change agenda. Like, we can't be ourselves. And you have it also. This self-betterment is, and it's also part of the self-development ideology and all that fuckery, which starts from the basis that you are flawed and you need to better yourself and marketize yourself and all the rest of it. And basically at the end, and Marx said it, at the end of the day, you turn yourself into a commodity, right? And you have this crazy inversion that he describes in Capital, where you start having a market relation between people and social relation between commodities, right? The whole thing gets inverted. And I think it's so...
Especially with AI now.
Yeah, right. This great thing, I think capitalism is an AI. Capitalism is an AI.
Yeah, and it is really blurring, and Elon Musk is such a good example, because not only can you see he's deeply unhappy, he's such an insecure human being. Donald Trump, by the way, the same thing. But also still, they spend their lives with that obsessive need to be better. It's the Pakistani grooming gangs. It's this group. It's that group. It's that country. They just must be better. That obsessive need. That's why I always find it so interesting. These people who just we have them a lot in Netherlands. These people who spend their life, these young adults in their 20s, early 30s, dress well. These white guys who spend their life trying to prove why the white race is better than other people. They call them, how do they call themselves again? The neo, wow, what was the name again of these guys? The neo, what was that name of these new right wingers that you had for there was this hype of all very well dressed that were like the in the old days you had the Nazis, but these were like the fashionable like right wingers, these new up and coming young boys, and then you spend your life studying books and trying to find research that affirms in some way, shape, or form that you are better than other human beings, that you can literally spend hours of your energy of every day on trying to be better. The more you think about that, the more you realize what a deep, rotten pathology that is. If you really ask the question, and then what? Why is this important? Why do you need to be better than someone else? What's about that that's so important? And then, yeah, I don't know. You can notice how I've been really thinking about that. It's very natural in the beginning. When you grow up in the West, for me too, you always want to be the best in things. Oh, my group is the best. We are Westerners. Oh, we're Dutch. We had the golden age. We had an empire. We were a world superpower. Oh my God, we were so great. And then and on the individual level, you have that self-enhancement, self-optimization, continuously. I need to be better. I need to be successful. And then the moment you really start to question it, why do you need to be better? Because somebody has different genitals, or somebody has a different skin color, or something. It's so weird. It's so strange if you really deeply think about it.
We need to defuse from these contexts, and kind of a takeaway I have from this conversation is that we need to look for ways, not just individually, but collectively in our communities, in our families, in our social circles, to ground in other values and in other economic systems, and that we need to practice them. We need to defuse from these colonial capitalist mindsets. And on a clinical level,
Absolutely.
It also makes me think about how we can bring awareness to what is coming up for a patient, or especially in a group session, because I love that kind of context and what you can do in that space to affirm what someone is experiencing, say anxiety or depression, as a normal response to a very abnormal situation. That this reality testing, reality affirmation can be really helpful in the clinical space.
Absolutely.
So, last thoughts, Benji, and then Karim.
Well, I don't have really any last thoughts, except that I feel, we've scratched the surface of that paper only, but what a great conversation. I'm so grateful we could have it with you, Karim, and I love to see that capitalism is now pointed out in the social psychology field, and I hope this is going to spread. And on my part, I hope I was able to impart you some of the reasons why you shouldn't be such a pessimist.
Well, my co-host Peter Beatty is also a much more optimist than I am. So he also tries to convince me, but I do like to listen to people who are more optimistic, because you do give me a temporary boost, but unfortunately it often slides down again after a while. But I must say, what does make me optimistic, I must admit this, I did not expect the amount of, I should actually say, the explosion of positive attention my paper got within my field. I literally got emails from emeritus professors who I would think they are so much molded in that old system they cannot appreciate it, who actually sent me very, very appreciative emails purely just for that paper, which really makes me optimistic. And not just that, a lot of undergraduate students. And that makes me happy, because when I was an undergraduate student, I avoided reading new papers as much as possible. So I'm amazed that there are quite a few undergraduates who actually read that stuff and then email me to thank me for that paper. That's so flattering. I mean, yeah, that's really, really cool. So indeed, that makes me optimistic. But I wanted to jump into something that Nunja just said. I think that's so important. So when you said that, like, oh, people who have these issues, it's not that they are abnormal. It's that's actually a normal adaptation to an abnormal situation. And that is so important for people to understand. Because in psychology too, and probably in psychiatry as well, for a very long time, when people came with pain and stress about, for example, being discriminated all the time, which made them paranoid in certain situations, or I should say hypervigilant. Let's put it different. Let's say hypervigilant. In psychology, there is this trend to just get cognitive therapy. You need to change your thought processes. In other words, you need to change your thought process to adapt your brain to an unhealthy situation. In other words, you need to become sick to feel fitting in a sick society, instead of the fact that you have a very natural response to a sick environment. And that is something that is often lacking, to the extent that people themselves, victims, blame themselves for the feelings that they have. Like, why am I so scared? Why am I so paranoid? Why am I so nervous when I go out the door? No, it's a normal reaction. Your body shuts down because your environment is threatening. And that brings me to a special issue I once did, and maybe you will find it interesting, Benji and Nunja. It's called The Social Psychology of Neoliberalism. I did that in 2019. It was a special issue for the Journal of Social Issues. And it's a multidisciplinary journal. And there we had a collection of papers of people explaining what neoliberalism did to their field. And there are also clinical papers. And one is a rape clinic, or rape trauma clinic, something like that, who also talk about that neoliberalization and also that individualization of victimhood. Mm-hmm. And I think you may find that interesting. And if you cannot access those papers, please tell me. Then I'll just find a way to download them through my university account and send it to you. I think you may find it interesting.
So things actually showed up for me. What you described earlier about the reception for your paper is what, all communists would have called a sign of a pre-revolutionary period.
I hope.
And the second point is, I wanted to talk about, maybe that's for another conversation, in your conversation about Islamophobia on your podcast. I forget the name with Dr. What is her name?
Amina Sharif.
Amina Sharif, right? Amazing conversation. If you have an opportunity, please watch it. You started talking about the colonial mindset, and I think there's a conversation to be had about the rationality of staying inside the system, and how you the choice between staying inside and resistance, which we also see play out in Palestine. But that's for another conversation, I'm sure.
Absolutely, and often there is a when you do a cost-benefit analysis as a human being, often there is a benefit to stay in that system. I mean, it's baffling to me why we have so many Muslims or ex-Muslims in the Netherlands who just say the most horrendous stuff about their own people. You would think, why would they do that? But there is a lot of reward. And again, contextual kind of rewards that make people behave in these ways. And that's like you said, a good topic for another conversation.
Nunja is great for concluding conversations, so let her do it.
Definitely.
Well, that brings up what can be a psychologically healthy response to experiencing racism, colonialism, discrimination, which is to change material conditions and join the resistance. So thank you so much, Karim, for speaking with us today. We will link to your media in the show notes. And until next time, remember, resistance is fertile.